I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it actually looks like to try to practice meeting folks where they are, and through doing that through a door-to-door process. So what is deep canvassing? What does this mean to have consciousness-raising conversations? I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the form of script iteration, or what we called script iteration. Typically, in traditional forms of canvassing, there is a script that gets designed by someone in a campaign team that is meant to be as plug and play as possible. And so something that a canvasser can show up, quickly learn, and then be able to use on a door as quickly as possible to get the desired outcome of a Canvas conversation, which may be something like a signature or a commitment for support or something like that. And so what that means is that conversations are often very quick, very short, and adhere very closely to a script. In deep canvassing, we kind of invert that model and flip it on its head, in that instead of having a top-down script generation process, it's very bottom-up, in that the canvassers generated the script that we use based on the conversations they were having with voters. And they were not just carriers of the message, but crafters of the message. And so their knowledge and insight from being people engaging in these conversations was prioritized. And then the way that those conversations took place in the door tended to be longer and more focused on building an emotional connection with the voter, in the hope of being able to help move that voter to a more supportive place on a particular immigration issue while reducing their stigma toward undocumented immigrants. And the way that this works is that we would take a draft script, converse with voters, be on the doors, come back together at the end of the night, do a robust debrief, revise the script based on what was working and not working, and then take it back out on the doors the next night, and keep doing that process until we got to a script that our Canvas teams across all 3 sites felt like was working in terms of connecting with voters and moving voters. We then stopped iterating our script, and we took the script that we had generated, and then we implemented it in Canvas. And we invited those academic colleagues that I mentioned, Dr. Josh Calla and Dr. David Brockman, to measure the impact of those conversations. And what you're seeing on your screen is just a quick snapshot of who we talked to, as well as who our canvassers were. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I want to be sure we have plenty of time for conversation, but the highlights are that we talked to a diverse array of voters across the political spectrum, and we had a diverse array of canvassers. And part of the way the measurement process worked is that the people we were canvassing were participating in pre and post surveys, and they didn't know those surveys that were gauging their movement on policy and prejudice issues were connected to the Canvas conversation happening at the door. And the canvassers didn't know the policy and prejudice support scores of the voters they were talking to. And as a result of our conversations, we were incredibly encouraged and excited to learn that we generated 8 new supporters for the pro-immigrant policies that we were measuring for every 100 completed conversations. And for folks who haven't done much canvassing, the sort of roughly half of us on the call, this may not sound like a lot, but in reality, 8 new supporters is 8 folks who are not with the opposition in a campaign context. So that can actually translate to about a 16-point shift. And on controversial, contentious issues like immigration, 16 points can be a game changer. And encouragingly, this wasn't just movement on policy, but we also saw significant movement on prejudice reduction. And encouragingly, the movement lasted. And so we did some follow-up surveys 3 to 6 months after canvassing, in which we saw that 6 of those 8 new supporters were still with us. So what was it about these conversations that was creating the movement? I want to highlight 6 things that we should be able to talk a little bit more about in conversation, as the conversation section as well, which is we identified that non-judgmental listening and asking open-ended questions were really critical. So being able to invite folks to do some processing and doing our very best to listen to their concerns, listen to what was coming up for them around these issues without judgment. We also prioritized acknowledging their concerns and mixed feelings, being able to say like, hey, some people have mixed feelings about these issues and that's okay, and helping invite them to a more supportive place. We also bridged with shared values. In our particular canvas, that involved invoking memories of receiving compassion. So we were asking and inviting voters to share a story, to go back into their memory of a time when they received compassion, and helped connect that to how we should be treating undocumented immigrants in the US. We also assessed that honest, vulnerable story sharing was critical to the movement impacts that we saw. And learning how to tell our stories, both an immigration story and a story of receiving compassion, is critical to that work. And then finally, that practice in terms of how to have a conversation, how to connect across difference. Practice is key. Getting comfortable with how to do this, feeling confident taking up space on the doorstep is vital. And then in closing, one thing that I often hear when I talk about this canvas and our results is folks saying, that's amazing, and I could never do that. I could never go door to door, or I could never talk to people who see these issues differently from me. And one of the things that I think is most important in terms of doing this is actually just being open to and curious about where another person sits on these issues, and being willing to be generous and open of mind and heart in having these conversations. So whether it's around the water cooler or at the front door or across the dinner table, there's a lot that we can do in terms of just being willing to see people where they're at. And I want to close with this quote that kind of sums this up from our lead canvasser in Orange County, Cynthia Sanchez. She says, this program helped us open our horizons about what it means to build a social justice movement that bridges gaps between race and socioeconomic classes. We learned that transformation can be an intentional process, that there are people all over Orange County waiting to be transformed if only we knock on their door and take a chance.